My dad spent $125,000 meant for my college on his new family. It all started with a quiet morning over breakfast, the kind where everything feels oddly normal. I remember the sound of the coffee pot hissing, the clink of dishes, and my mom humming something softly as she buttered toast. Then came the knock on the door, a sound that changed everything. The courier handed over a manila envelope, and I barely glanced at it until Mom froze mid-step. Her face went pale as she ripped it open, her hands trembling. Divorce papers. My dad, David, had decided he was done with us. Back then, I still believed his promises. He swore up and down he would always be there for me, even if he and Mom couldn't stay together. "You'll have everything you need for college," he'd said, over and over. "I've got a special account set up just for you." He'd repeated it so many times it felt like a security blanket I didn't need to think about until now. That envelope shattered whatever illusions I had left. Weeks turned into months, and Dad seemed to disappear into thin air. Calls went unanswered, texts were ignored, and the few times he did respond, his excuses felt paper-thin. He was busy, he claimed, dealing with complicated things. I didn't understand what could be so complicated about keeping your promises. But life doesn't stop just because your family falls apart. Eventually, he resurfaced. It was supposed to be a friendly meeting at a local coffee shop, a chance to catch up and clear the air. I went in hoping for an explanation, maybe even an apology. Instead, he brought Lauren. She was his new wife, a polished woman with an unsettlingly bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. Lauren was the kind of person who ordered oat milk lattes with extra foam and made a show of drinking them out of environmentally friendly straws. She sat there like she belonged in our story, and I wanted to scream. Dad didn't waste any time getting to the point. He smiled, as if this was some kind of celebratory moment, and casually mentioned that the college fund I'd been counting on, all $125,000 of it, was gone. "It went toward a fresh start," he said, glancing at Lauren like she was the best investment he'd ever made. I couldn't believe it. Years of savings, promises, and sacrifices wiped out for a fresh start that didn't include me. I'd never felt rage like that before. It wasn't the kind that explodes all at once. It simmered, boiling under the surface until it threatened to consume me. My mind raced with all the what-ifs and could-be beans. That money was supposed to be my ticket to a better life, a way out of the chaos he'd left behind. And now it was gone just like him. Leaving that coffee shop felt like stepping into a different world, one where I couldn't rely on anyone but myself. My mom tried to console me, but her own grief left her drained. She offered moral support, but the weight of rebuilding my future fell squarely on my shoulders. I spent nights scouring the internet for scholarships, grants, anything that could help. I picked up shifts at the local diner, balancing plates and forced smiles as I scraped together what little I could. Giving up wasn't an option. If Dad's fresh start didn't include me, then I'd create one of my own. But even as I pushed forward, the sting of betrayal lingered. I couldn't shake the image of Dad and Lauren sitting there, sipping their overpriced drinks like nothing was wrong. The anger fueled me, driving me to prove I didn't need him or his promises. Still, a part of me wondered if I'd ever really escape the shadow of what he'd done. That question haunted me as I pieced together the fragments of my life, one grueling step at a time. Balancing 2 jobs was harder than I'd imagined. My days started before the sun came up, and by the time I dragged myself home at night, my legs felt like lead. But every time I thought about quitting, I reminded myself of why I was doing this. That money Dad had stolen from me wasn't just a college fund. It was my shot at a future. I wasn't about to let his choices define me. Luckily, I wasn't entirely alone in this fight. Chloe, my best friend since middle school, refused to let me drown in my own frustration. She'd show up at my place with a laptop and snacks, ready to help me fill out endless scholarship applications. It felt like a never-ending cycle of essays, deadlines, and rejection emails, but Chloe kept pushing me forward. She believed in me even when I struggled to believe in myself. One evening, after an exhausting double shift, Chloe dragged me to a networking event hosted by a local business club. At first, I wasn't sure why I even agreed to go. My energy was drained, and I doubted anyone there would care about some overworked college hopeful. But that's where I met Ryan. He was sharp, confident, and quick to notice my hesitation. Somehow, we ended up in a deep conversation about ambition and family. Ryan's story was eerily familiar. His dad had also left his family in the lurch, and he'd fought tooth and nail to get where he was. He said he could see that same fight in me. His words caught me off guard. For the first time in months, I felt like someone truly understood what I was going through. Ryan's encouragement lit a spark I didn't realize I still had, and it gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone in this as I thought. The email came late at night, after another long day of juggling work and applications. I almost didn't open it, thinking it was just another rejection. But there it was, an acceptance from the campus scholarship program. They had chosen me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to cry tears of relief. That single moment made every sleepless night, every double shift, and every ounce of frustration worth it. It wasn't just about the money. It was proof that my hard work mattered, that I wasn't stuck in the shadow of my father's choices. The scholarship didn't solve everything, but it gave me the breathing room I so desperately needed. I finally enrolled in classes and moved into a small campus apartment. That's where I met Avery, my neighbor. She was everything I hadn't realized I needed in a friend. Outgoing, funny, and unfiltered in the best way. Avery had a way of making even the most mundane moments feel like an adventure. She dragged me to movie nights, introduced me to her circle of friends, and reminded me that life wasn't just about surviving, it was about living. With my confidence slowly rebuilding, I started to feel like myself again. I threw myself into my studies, joined campus clubs, and even began to dream about the future. But just as things started looking up, David reappeared in the most infuriating way. One evening, Avery and I were scrolling through social media when I saw it. A post from my father, proudly sharing a picture of me with a caption, "So proud of my daughter for earning this incredible scholarship. Hard work pays off." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening with anger. How dare he? He had no right to take credit for my success after abandoning me when I needed him most. It was like he wanted to erase the damage he'd done with a single post, as if he could rewrite history to make himself look good. The audacity of it all was almost laughable. Avery noticed my reaction immediately and asked what was wrong. As I explained the situation, her usual lighthearted demeanor shifted. She told me I had every right to be angry, but reminded me not to let him take away from what I'd achieved. Her words stuck with me, even as the anger simmered. This wasn't just about my father's betrayal anymore. It was about reclaiming my narrative and refusing to let him define my story. That night, I decided not to respond to his post. Instead, I focused on what mattered, building a future that had nothing to do with him. My successes were mine alone, and no social media post could change that. Still, the experience left a mark, a reminder of how deep the wounds ran and how far I'd come in spite of them. For the first time, I felt a strange mix of anger and empowerment, knowing I could face whatever came next. As I found my footing, I decided to turn all the anger and pain I'd been carrying into something constructive. It hit me late one night as I sat at my desk, surrounded by empty coffee mugs and scattered notes. There were probably so many students out there like me, left stranded without financial support, struggling to keep their dreams alive. That's when I came up with the idea for the Second Chance Fund. I reached out to Professor Carter, who had a reputation for supporting student-led initiatives. I laid out my vision and asked for his guidance. His response was better than I could have hoped for. He not only believed in my idea, but also offered to mentor me through the process. From drafting proposals to preparing presentations, he walked me through every step. It felt empowering to have someone so experienced in my corner. As my project gained traction, word began to spread around campus. I was excited to see how many people supported the idea, but that's when the unexpected happened. My father, David, found out about the fund. Apparently, his college friend, Professor Harris, worked in the same department as Professor Carter. During a casual conversation, Harris mentioned my project, and suddenly, David was trying to insert himself into my plans. He reached out to the administration under the guise of offering advice. In reality, he was trying to reshape my fund to align with his own agenda. It felt like a calculated move to steal the spotlight, just as he'd done before. I was furious. This wasn't his battle, and he had no right to interfere. Things got even more complicated when Lauren contacted me. She admitted she hadn't known the full extent of David's actions and, to my surprise, offered her support. It was strange. Lauren, who I'd resented for so long, was now on my side. Her sympathy seemed genuine, but it also created visible tension between her and David. Their arguments started spilling into public view, and it only added to the mess I was trying to navigate. Throughout all of this, Ryan became my rock. His understanding and encouragement kept me grounded when everything else felt chaotic. We spent hours brainstorming ways to counter David's interference, from gathering student testimonials to solidifying my partnership with Professor Carter. Ryan reminded me why I had started the fund in the first place, and that clarity was exactly what I needed. By the time the dust settled, I felt stronger. The fund wasn't just about providing financial aid anymore. It was about proving to myself that I could create something meaningful despite the obstacles. But even as I moved forward, the conflict with my father loomed over me, reminding me that the hardest battles were still to come. The day of graduation felt surreal, like standing at the edge of a cliff and looking back at everything it took to get there. My hands trembled as I adjusted my gown and took my place among the sea of graduates. The weight of the moment was overwhelming, but this wasn't just a ceremony for me. It was the culmination of every sleepless night, every fight to reclaim my future, and every ounce of resilience I'd scraped together. I'd been named the valedictorian, and with that came the honor and the terror of addressing the entire audience. As I stood at the podium, I could feel hundreds of eyes on me, waiting for me to speak. I took a deep breath and started my speech, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. I spoke about the importance of perseverance, about how life isn't always fair, but how we have the power to rise above the challenges thrown our way. I shared just enough of my story to make an impact, careful to focus on the lessons rather than the pain. But as I spoke, I couldn't help but glance toward the crowd, where I saw David and Lauren sitting near the back. Their presence sent a chill down my spine, but I pushed through. Near the front, my mom was sitting with a proud but tearful smile, clapping harder than anyone else. Seeing her there reminded me of the sacrifices she had made and the quiet strength she'd always shown. When I reached the heart of my speech, I paused, letting the silence hang in the air. I admitted that my journey hadn't been easy and that I'd faced obstacles I never expected. I told them about how I'd lost my financial security, how I'd worked 2 jobs while juggling applications, and how the setbacks had only fueled my determination. Without naming names, I made it clear that some of the greatest challenges came from people who should have been my biggest supporters. The room fell silent, the weight of my words sinking in. The applause when I finished was deafening. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering, but all I could focus on was David. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. For the first time, I saw something that almost looked like regret. He'd spent so long trying to control the narrative, and now the truth was out, and it was mine to tell. After the ceremony, the crowd buzzed with excitement as graduates hugged their families and took photos. I felt a mix of pride and exhaustion, but there was no time to rest. The next step was the official announcement of the Second Chance Fund. Professor Carter had helped organize a small reception after the ceremony, where I unveiled the fund to the community. Standing in front of the banner with the fund's name, I felt a swell of pride unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about creating opportunities for others who had been left behind. Lauren approached me after the reception. She looked different, less polished and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. She admitted she'd misjudged me and that she admired what I'd accomplished. I could see the cracks in her relationship with David, but I didn't press her for details. Instead, I let her words sink in. For the first time, I didn't feel resentment toward her. Letting go of that bitterness felt like shedding a heavy weight I'd carried for too long. Ryan found me not long after, a steady presence amid the chaos. He didn't need to say much. His support had been constant, and his encouragement had been a lifeline. Together, we walked away from the reception, the future no longer feeling like an uphill battle but an open road waiting to be explored. Before the day ended, I found myself at the park near campus, the one where I used to go to clear my head. That's where I saw David, sitting alone on a bench. He looked smaller somehow, like the weight of his choices had finally caught up with him. I didn't approach him right away, just watched from a distance as he stared at the ground. When I finally walked over, he glanced up, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. I didn't let him speak first. I told him I wasn't looking for an apology, but he had a choice to make. He could either start being the father he'd promised to be all those years ago, or he could fade into a memory. It was his decision now, and I wasn't going to wait around for an answer. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving him to sit with the weight of his regrets. As I left the park, I felt a strange sense of closure. The battles I'd fought had shaped me, but they no longer defined me. The future was mine to build, and for the first time in years, I felt ready to embrace it.
Bye bye.